keep your babies close to you. There's someone out there.
Surreal images of the pageant star transfix the nation.
Were you a stage mother?
Probably. What's wrong with that?
No charges have ever been filed, nobody ever convicted. Tonight, the theories, secrets, and bombshells.
Hurry. Patsy.
A CNN special report, the murder of JonBenét.
JonBenét Ramsey, a 6-year-old girl, was found dead in the basement of her home. A bizarre ransom note was left behind, but no one ever called to collect the money. There were no signs of forced entry, no foreign DNA, only the family was present. Her 9-year-old brother, Burke Ramsey, was the last known person to see JonBenét alive. His fingerprints were on the pineapple, his knife was discovered near her body, and many believe his voice can be heard at the end of the 911 call. Yet, in Netflix's 2024 docuseries, Cold Case: Who Killed JonBenét Ramsey, Burke is barely mentioned. Why? What is Burke hiding, and what truly happened on Christmas night, 1996? The problem with Netflix's docuseries. In November 2024, Netflix released Cold Case: Who Killed JonBenét Ramsey, directed by Oscar-nominated filmmaker Joe Berlinger. The 3-part series, each episode about an hour long, promised a fresh re-examination of one of America's most haunting unsolved murders, the death of 6-year-old beauty queen JonBenét Ramsey. The show set out to correct investigative missteps, examine the Boulder Police Department's mishandling of the crime scene, and highlight the impact of media frenzy. From the outset, Berlinger made it clear he did not believe the Ramsey family was guilty. Instead, he pushed for advanced DNA testing to identify the true killer and finally clear the family's name. But the strangest aspect of the series is that Burke Ramsey, the only other person in the house that night besides his parents, is barely addressed. Despite being the last to see JonBenét alive, Burke's name is mentioned only briefly without real depth or context. There is no detailed examination of his behavior, his statements, or the physical evidence connected to him. For a series claiming to analyze the case from every angle, this omission is glaring. What was left out? The 911 call made by Patsy Ramsey has long been scrutinized. Enhanced audio suggests a third voice can be heard at the end of the call, which many experts believe belongs to Burke. If true, this contradicts the Ramsey parents' claim that Burke was asleep throughout the incident. Then there's the infamous pineapple bowl found in the kitchen. Burke's fingerprints were on it, and partially digested pineapple was found in JonBenét's stomach. This seemingly small detail raises big questions. Did the siblings share a late-night snack? Did something go terribly wrong? Even more troubling is Burke's red Swiss Army knife. The housekeeper once hid it because Burke had used it to whittle. That same knife was later found near JonBenét's body in the basement, yet no clear explanation has ever been provided. There are also disturbing reports of Burke's childhood behavior, smearing feces on walls and candy boxes, showing emotional detachment, and displaying unsettling reactions during interviews. None of this is addressed in the Netflix series, nor does the series mention the multiple defamation lawsuits filed by the Ramsey family against media outlets and experts who publicly suggested Burke's involvement. Notably, CBS aired a 2016 documentary that pointed toward Burke, leading him to sue for $150 million. The case ended in a confidential settlement. The message was clear: accuse Burke, and there will be consequences. This could explain Netflix's choice to remain silent. A deliberate editorial decision? Missing from the series are key voices like Dr. Werner Spitz, FBI profiler James R. Fitzgerald, behavioral analyst Laura Richards, and forensic scientist Henry Lee, experts who have openly raised doubts about Burke. Instead, the production leans heavily on the unidentified intruder theory, portraying the Ramseys as victims of a media witch hunt. This doesn't appear to be a simple oversight. It looks like a calculated decision, likely influenced by legal caution, fear of controversy, or even pressure from the Ramsey legal team. Burke has long been at the center of suspicion. His 2016 interview on Dr. Phil, where his constant smiling and vague answers unsettled viewers, only intensified public doubt. Whether he speaks or stays silent, suspicion follows him. And yet, by omitting him, Netflix has only fueled more questions. Why are his fingerprints on the pineapple? Why was his knife near the body? Why is his voice possibly on the 911 call? If Burke is innocent, shouldn't he be the first to clear his name rather than the last to be mentioned? Berlinger is known for telling stories that defend those he believes have been wrongly accused. But in this case, has his sympathetic approach suppressed one of the most controversial leads? Critics argue that Cold Case, Who Killed JonBenét Ramsey, offers no new evidence. Instead, it spends more time dismantling the intruder theory than considering other viable explanations. Burke Ramsey's near-total absence is the elephant in the room. This is not just a storytelling flaw. It is a gaping hole in the heart of the investigation. At the very least, viewers deserve transparency. A mention of Burke's knife, a timeline involving the pineapple, and an explanation for the third voice on the 911 tape. These are not minor details. They are potential clues. By choosing not to address them, Netflix may have provided comfort, but not truth. So the real question is this: if Burke Ramsey had nothing to hide, why is everyone so afraid to talk about him? And more importantly, if the version of events presented by Netflix represents only half the truth, what is the other half they were unwilling to show? Because what comes next is everything left unsaid. Red flags from childhood. Burke Ramsey was the firstborn child of John and Patsy Ramsey, arriving 3 years before his younger sister, JonBenét. At the time of her death, Burke was 9 years old and occupied a quiet, almost invisible role within the household. The Ramseys lived in a large multi-level home in Boulder, Colorado. Burke's bedroom was located on the top floor, while JonBenét slept on the second floor, closer to the kitchen, living areas, and the center of family life. This physical separation mirrored an emotional and psychological gap within the family dynamic. Unlike his younger sister, Burke avoided the spotlight. JonBenét, a child beauty pageant queen, was adored by the media and by her parents, especially Patsy, who had once been a pageant queen herself. Patsy devoted enormous amounts of time and energy to preparing her daughter for competitions, designing costumes, applying makeup, and organizing rehearsals. As a result, much of the household's focus revolved around JonBenét, while Burke often retreated into a solitary world of video games, computers, and Lego creations. Reports from those close to the family, including the housekeeper, describe Burke as a boy who spent most of his time alone, rarely interacting with family members or friends. His isolation was not only physical, but also emotional. He did not seem to express feelings the way other children did. In an interview after JonBenét's death, Burke spoke of her in a tone curiously detached, more like describing a character from television than his own sister. Psychological evaluations later described Burke as under-socialized, someone who struggled to share thoughts and was not especially affectionate or emotionally expressive. This flatness could have been a defense mechanism, or perhaps a symptom of deeper psychological issues. Whether caused by personality, parenting, or underlying conditions, Burke appeared withdrawn from the social and emotional core of the Ramsey family. Troubling behavior. What raises greater concern is that Burke was not only emotionally detached, but he also displayed a troubling pattern of behavior, sometimes aggressive, even disturbing, long before the murder took place. One of the most widely discussed issues was his repeated fecal smearing. Multiple sources, including the housekeeper and investigative reports, stated that Burke had a history of smearing feces on walls, in bathrooms, and even on JonBenét's personal belongings. In one particularly disturbing case, feces were found smeared on a Christmas gift intended for JonBenét and on her bed. In child psychology, fecal smearing, also known as scatological behavior, is considered a serious red flag. It can signal unresolved anger, emotional trauma, or an attempt to assert control in situations where the child feels powerless. When directed specifically at another person, it may reveal deep-seated resentment or aggression. In Burke's case, this raises the question, was he expressing through his actions something he could not put into words? There was also the well-documented incident in which Burke struck JonBenét in the face with a golf club, leaving her with a visible scar. While the parents dismissed it as an accident during play, forensic psychologists and investigators viewed it differently. They interpreted it as evidence of underlying aggression, possibly unrecognized, misunderstood, but nonetheless dangerous. The fact that this injury occurred in the months leading up to JonBenét's death is especially troubling. Burke also had a reputation for difficulty controlling his temper. Testimonies from the housekeeper and others close to the family described him as a child who would lash out when things did not go his way. On one occasion, he snapped a toy JonBenét was playing with simply because she had not asked for permission. In another, JonBenét was left in tears after Burke refused to let her play with his Lego set. While these incidents could be dismissed as ordinary sibling rivalry, in the context of later events, they appear far more sinister. Finally, there was Burke's fixation on sharp objects and tools. He owned a red Swiss Army knife that he often used for whittling, usually without supervision. The family housekeeper admitted that she once felt compelled to hide the knife for safety reasons. The questionable absence on the morning of December 26, 1996. Between approximately 5:30 a.m. and 6 a.m., Patsy Ramsey discovered a ransom note in the family's Boulder, Colorado home. It was found at the bottom of the staircase, and she immediately dialed 911. During that call, and in the first moments of panic, Burke Ramsey was reportedly still asleep in his upstairs bedroom. According to both John and Patsy Ramsey, Burke had slept through the night and was not awake at the time of the discovery. Patsy stated that she chose not to wake him, fearing it would cause unnecessary distress. As a result, Burke remained uninvolved during the first critical stages of the incident. When Boulder police officers arrived at the Ramsey residence shortly before 6:10 a.m., Burke was not present in the main living areas. Officers did not encounter him in the entryway, kitchen, or living room. Instead, he stayed upstairs, separated from the center of events and shielded from the ongoing police activity. He was given breakfast and kept busy with his toys. That morning, Burke was not questioned by responding officers. No one asked him directly about the previous night, nor whether he had seen or heard anything unusual. He was not included in any part of the search or early investigative efforts. While the search for JonBenét continued, Burke remained isolated. Later, when Detective Linda Arndt instructed John Ramsey and family friend Fleet White to search the house again for any sign of JonBenét, Burke was not involved. He was not present when John and Fleet went down to the basement and discovered her body. Throughout this entire period, Burke stayed away from the central areas of activity. From the time of the 911 call to the tragic discovery of JonBenét's body, spanning several hours, Burke's role was minimal. He was kept away from police, search teams, and family discussions. He neither participated in the search nor was observed showing concern or engagement with the unfolding emergency. This sequence of events marked a period when Burke was physically in the house, but conspicuously absent from every active response to his sister's disappearance. The missing mentions. One of the first notable omissions came from Fleet White, a close friend of John Ramsey and a key figure that morning. White was the one who ultimately urged John to check the basement, a decision that led to JonBenét's discovery. Yet in recounting the events of that morning, Fleet never once mentioned Burke. For someone physically present in the house, this silence raised early questions. Was Burke being intentionally kept apart, and if so, why? That same morning, Burke was reportedly given McDonald's breakfast by another family friend, Susan Stein. This occurred not long after police had arrived. While it may seem like a small detail, the timing and nature of this action, removing Burke from the central environment and tending to him separately, suggests a deliberate effort to control his exposure at a moment when officers and detectives were working to understand a possible kidnapping. Isolating the only other child in the house appeared at best overly protective and at worst calculated. Conflicting accounts. Adding to the uncertainty were Patsy Ramsey's shifting statements. In some interviews, she claimed Burke was never awakened and knew nothing about the chaos. Yet in other accounts, she recalled him asking, "What's going on?" A clear contradiction. This inconsistency suggests Burke may have been more aware of the situation than initially admitted. Was he awake during the 9/11 call? Did he hear voices, footsteps, or panic? These questions grow louder when paired with forensic audio analysis of that very call. The 911 call analysis. In the final 6 seconds of the recording, enhanced audio revealed what many experts believe to be 3 voices: Patsy, John, and a child, possibly Burke. Patsy is heard saying, "What did you do?" John replies, "We're not speaking to you." And faintly, a child's voice answers. According to retired investigator James Kohler, author of Foreign Faction, internal FBI reports suggested it was highly probable that the child's voice belonged to Burke, though this has never been officially confirmed or released publicly. The implication is significant. If Burke was speaking after the call ended, then he was awake and within earshot, contradicting his family's claims that he had slept through everything. The fact that Burke was never formally interviewed by police that morning only deepens the mystery. Burke Ramsey's isolation in the first 48 hours. During the first 48 hours following the incident, Burke Ramsey was kept away from investigators. He was not questioned immediately, but instead interviewed later in a controlled environment with attorneys and child psychologists hired by the Ramseys. For law enforcement, this was highly irregular. In most missing child cases, everyone in the household, regardless of age, would be questioned quickly and independently. Burke's separation from the investigative process was a glaring break from standard protocol. The explanation provided by the Ramseys was consistent. They were trying to protect their son. Yet the degree of control over his environment, his interactions, his statements, even his breakfast, suggested something beyond simple protection. It suggested orchestration. More broadly, the claim that Burke slept through the entire morning has long been questioned. The Ramsey home was large, but not soundproof. A 911 call was made. Voices were raised. There was movement and crying. Given the household's emotional state and the short time frame before officers arrived, many experts have found it implausible that Burke remained asleep and unaware. Why it matters. This detail is significant because Burke's presence or absence directly affects the timeline. If he had been awake, a frightened or confused child might have displayed emotional responses, asked questions, or shown visible signs of trauma. Instead, Burke was kept isolated, away from the central events of the investigation. His removal from these critical moments coincided with other unusual behaviors from his parents that same morning. Patsy Ramsey claimed to have discovered the ransom note almost immediately upon waking at 5:30 a.m. and called 911 within minutes. Despite the gravity of the situation, when police arrived, she was fully dressed, made up, and composed, an unusual level of readiness for a mother who had just found her daughter missing. John Ramsey's actions also drew scrutiny. Though told to search the house earlier in the day, he did not do so until hours later, after Fleet White urged him to check the basement. It was then that John discovered JonBenét's body. Instead of preserving the scene, he picked her up and carried her upstairs, contaminating critical evidence. A pattern of roles. These actions, Patsy making the 911 call, John discovering the body, and Burke remaining separated, created a strange symmetry in the morning's events. Each family member seemed to have a defined role. Nothing overlapped. No one appeared frantic, and no one contradicted the others in real time. For many investigators, this degree of coordination resembled stagecraft rather than a spontaneous family crisis. Adding to suspicion, officers noted that despite the tragedy and chaos, the Ramseys displayed remarkable composure. There were no visible breakdowns, no frantic questioning of police, no uncontrolled panic. Instead, they seemed to know exactly what to say, where to stand, and how to behave. To some observers, this suggested a family struggling to maintain control of a situation that was already spiraling beyond it. The discovery of JonBenét's body. At approximately 1 p.m. on December 26, 1996, JonBenét Ramsey's body was discovered in the basement of the Ramsey home. The discovery was made by John Ramsey and his friend Fleet White, after Detective Linda Arndt asked them to search the house once more. John opened the door to the wine cellar and found his daughter's body. In the aftermath, several key pieces of physical evidence emerged, many of which linked back to Burke. One of the most scrutinized was the bowl of pineapple found on the kitchen table. At first glance, it seemed insignificant, yet it became one of the most discussed clues of the entire case. The bowl contained pineapple mixed with milk, and Burke's fingerprints were found on it. Autopsy results revealed undigested pineapple in JonBenét's stomach, strongly suggesting she had eaten it shortly before her death. The logical conclusion drawn by investigators was that Burke and JonBenét had been in the kitchen together, eating a late-night snack. If true, this would place Burke as the last known person to see his sister alive. Despite the importance of this detail, it was downplayed in early reports and virtually absent from much of the media coverage. Burke's own account further complicated matters. He insisted he had been asleep the entire night and did not wake up until after police arrived. But the pineapple evidence told a different story. When combined with the enhanced audio from the 911 call, in which a child's voice, believed by many to be Burke's, can be faintly heard asking, "What did you find?" It strongly suggests that he may have been awake, aware, and present during critical moments of the case. Signs in the basement. Moving to the basement where JonBenét's body was eventually discovered, investigators encountered additional unsettling signs, including traces of human feces in the area. Evidence found. Near the body. In the basement, close to where JonBenét's body was discovered, investigators noted traces of human feces. While this detail was not included in the official forensic reports released to the public, multiple sources and former detectives have confirmed its presence. Its relevance becomes clearer when compared to Burke Ramsey's prior behavioral history, which included incidents of fecal smearing. The proximity of feces to the body is not only disturbing but also potentially revealing. Although no direct forensic link tied Burke to this particular evidence, the circumstantial overlap is difficult to dismiss, especially when considered alongside the pineapple evidence and the red pocket knife. The small red pocket knife, which Burke often used for whittling, was discovered on the floor near JonBenét's body. The family's housekeeper had previously hidden the knife due to concerns about Burke's obsession with it and the risk of injury. That it reappeared next to a murdered child has never been fully explained. Authorities did not conclude that the knife was used as the murder weapon, but its placement in such a sensitive and incriminating location raised far more questions than it answered. Another suspicious object was a black Maglite flashlight found inside the Ramsey home. Many experts believe it could have caused the depressed skull fracture documented in JonBenét's autopsy. The flashlight's size, weight, and flat surface matched the injury. Strikingly, it was wiped clean of fingerprints, suggesting an intentional effort to eliminate evidence. While there is no proof that Burke handled it that night, he was known to play with flashlights, and the item was found in an area he could easily access. The abrasions and the toy train theory. JonBenét's autopsy also revealed two small circular abrasions, one on her lower back and another near her neck. Initially, some investigators theorized these marks were caused by a stun gun, a theory that supported the possibility of an intruder. Detective Lou Smith was among those who believed an outsider had used such a weapon to subdue the child without alerting the household. However, the stun gun explanation began to unravel. Forensic pathologists, including Dr. Werner Spitz and former investigator James Kohler, pointed out that the abrasions showed none of the characteristics of electrical burns, no charring, no tissue damage, no signs consistent with stun gun use. Instead, the wounds were clean, uniform in diameter, and matched almost exactly the spacing between the metal prongs of a toy train track. This revelation shifted attention to a toy train set belonging to Burke. Investigators noted that pieces of track from Burke's train set in the basement aligned perfectly with the dimensions of the abrasions. The emerging theory suggested that the injuries may have been caused by someone pressing the metal track ends against JonBenét's skin. While these wounds were not fatal, they likely occurred shortly before or after her death. This raised troubling questions. Was someone trying to test if she was alive? Were these injuries part of play violence or an attempt to provoke a response? Netflix's 2024 docuseries, Cold Case: Who Killed JonBenét Ramsey, made no mention of this train track evidence, despite its strong forensic implications and clear visual match to the abrasions. The omission reinforced the perception that the series deliberately avoided details that could implicate Burke, perhaps to avoid legal risks or controversy. Burke's absence and emotional void. Adding to the unease was Burke's lack of visible emotional reaction. There are no photos, videos, or eyewitness accounts of him crying, asking questions, or showing any outward grief over his sister's death. No teacher, neighbor, or family friend ever recalled Burke expressing sadness, confusion, or trauma. In most sibling death cases, even young children exhibit clear emotional distress. That Burke did not, or that no such reactions were ever documented, remains a glaring gap in the narrative. Even more striking, Burke was absent from nearly all public events connected to JonBenét's death. He did not attend memorial services, was not seen at the funeral, and never appeared in family press statements. While one explanation is that he was shielded for protection, the level of exclusion suggested he was being kept away for reasons that went beyond emotional well-being. This isolation extended to psychological care. In typical cases of child trauma, intervention is immediate. But Burke did not receive prompt counseling. No therapist visited the house. No grief support was arranged. Professional help was only introduced days later under the coordination of the Ramsey legal team. All records of Burke's behavior and statements from that period were controlled exclusively by family attorneys. No police psychologist, school counselor, or independent social worker was allowed to evaluate him. A pattern of control. Burke's post-incident behavior also stood out. There were no reports of him keeping mementos of his sister, no toys, drawings, or photos. Most grieving siblings, especially at a young age, hold on to such connections. Burke did not. Similarly, there were no documented moments of Patsy or John physically comforting him. No hugs, no reassurances, no shared grief. Instead, Burke's treatment resembled that of someone quarantined, not a child mourning a sibling, but a variable being managed under legal strategy. Perhaps the most chilling detail comes from an informal note by an officer present in the house. According to the observation, even after being told of his sister's death, Burke displayed no outward signs of emotion, not crying, not yelling, not even confusion. While not definitive evidence of guilt, this was far from the expected reaction of a 9-year-old confronted with tragedy. The broader pattern. Individually, each piece of evidence might seem inconclusive, but taken together, Burke's fingerprints on the pineapple bowl, the undigested pineapple in JonBenét's stomach, his missing emotional response, the knife in the basement, the flashlight wiped clean, the feces near the body, the legal shielding, the media silence, they form a troubling mosaic. No single element proves Burke's guilt, yet collectively, they construct a haunting pattern that suggests more happened that night than has ever been officially acknowledged. And perhaps most tellingly, none of this has been directly addressed in major documentaries or media coverage, particularly Netflix's 2024 series. Instead, the narrative focused on intruder theories, dismissing or ignoring circumstantial evidence pointing towards someone inside the house. Whether Burke was truly involved or simply the unfortunate focus of suspicion, one fact remains undeniable. Too many questions were left unanswered. The silence around Burke Ramsey. The lack of both emotional and investigative attention surrounding Burke Ramsey may be the most telling clue of all. To this day, the question persists. Not only who killed JonBenét Ramsey, but also why did no one truly look at Burke? In the immediate aftermath of JonBenét's murder, between December 27th and December 31st, 1996, no formal interviews were conducted with Burke. Acting on the advice of their legal team, the Ramseys refused to make him available to police, precisely when his memory could have contained critical details. No statements were collected. Law enforcement later referred to this delay as a serious setback to the investigation. It wasn't until January 6, 1997, 11 days after JonBenét's body was discovered, that Burke was formally interviewed. The conditions were tightly controlled, family lawyers were present, and no independent investigators were allowed in the room. During this interview, Burke stuck to one narrative. He had been asleep the entire night. He claimed he hadn't heard anything, not a scream, not the 911 call, not even his parents moving about. His answers were short, guarded, and emotionally flat. Over a year later, in June 1998, Burke was interviewed again as part of the grand jury proceedings initiated by the Boulder District Attorney. This session, videotaped and later partially released to the public, only deepened the unease. Observers noted Burke's unusual lack of emotional expression, even when shown graphic photos of the crime scene, including the room where JonBenét's body was found. He didn't flinch, didn't ask questions, didn't express sadness or shock. When asked key questions like, "Did you see your sister that night?" or "Did you get up during the night?" he avoided direct answers. Child psychology experts remarked how highly uncommon it was for a 9-year-old to speak with such detachment about a sibling's violent death. There were no tears, no confusion, no grief, just calm, measured responses that revealed nothing. Psychological assessments. In January 1997, shortly after his first police interview, the Ramseys arranged for Burke to begin private counseling with Dr. Suzanne Bernard, a licensed clinical psychologist. Though framed as emotional support, her sessions produced unsettling observations. She noted that Burke showed signs of emotional blunting. He never cried when discussing his sister, never showed visible sadness, and described the morning's events as though they had happened to someone else. When asked if anyone had taught him how to lie, Burke replied, "Nopey," before abruptly pivoting the conversation to Legos and video games, an example of clear emotional deflection. In one session, Burke was asked to draw a map of the house. He included remarkable detail, even adding the wine cellar, the very room where JonBenét's body was found. This raised red flags because the family had claimed Burke had never entered that room, contradicting his earlier statement that he had no awareness of what happened that night. Perhaps most disturbing was Burke's response to the meaning of death. When asked what it meant that JonBenét had died, he simply said, "If someone's dead, you bury them. That's what you do." The cold, matter-of-fact tone shocked professionals in the room. To many, it sounded less like a grieving child and more like someone emotionally distancing himself from the event. Across multiple sessions from January through mid-1997, Burke repeated the same refrain. I was asleep. He never elaborated, never asked questions like, "Where is she?" or "Who did this?" His absence of curiosity was deeply unusual. Internal police notes and later memoirs, such as James Kohler's Foreign Faction, highlighted this emotional detachment. Even under questioning, Burke remained controlled and guarded. He showed no breakdowns, no emotional outbursts, no visible distress. While some professionals suggested this calmness might have been a coping mechanism, the consistency of his detachment was alarming. Most children in traumatic situations display volatility, crying, nightmares, regressions. Burke displayed none. The most scrutinized silence. In hindsight, Burke's interviews, both with police and with psychologists, became some of the most scrutinized aspects of the case, not because he contradicted himself or confessed, but because he revealed so little. Outwardly, he appeared to be a 9-year-old boy who had just lost his sister, yet he didn't seem to care. Burke was never charged with anything. He maintained the same story in every interview. He was asleep, he didn't know, he didn't see. Over the years, that silence became his defining trait. Even decades later, when he appeared publicly, the emotional distance remained, breaking his silence on Dr. Phil. In September 2016, nearly 20 years after JonBenét's murder, Burke broke his silence for the first time. He agreed to a multi-part interview on the Dr. Phil show, timed to coincide with the 20th anniversary of his sister's death. The interview, pre-recorded and carefully structured, took place in a private setting away from a live audience. Burke was asked about the night of December 25th to 26th, 1996, his memories of JonBenét, and his reflections on the case that defined his family. Some segments aired alongside Dr. Phil's studio discussions, where the host shared his own psychological observations of Burke's demeanor. Burke said he wanted to clear his name. He denied any involvement in JonBenét's death and repeated that he had slept through the night, unaware of the chaos. He claimed his parents advised him to stay silent. But as an adult, he now wanted the truth known. Yet what drew attention was not his words, but how he delivered them. Throughout the interview, Burke smiled, even while discussing traumatic events. Viewers found the smile unsettling. When Dr. Phil confronted him about it, Burke explained that he was simply nervous, that he had always been a happy person, and that discussing JonBenét made him anxious. Dr. Phil later suggested Burke may suffer from social anxiety disorder, which could explain the incongruent expressions. Burke denied every direct accusation. Asked bluntly, "Did you kill your sister?" He answered immediately, "Nope." He denied ever striking her with an object or behaving violently toward her. He repeated that he never heard anything unusual that night, not the 911 call, not shouting, not panic. Still, many viewers remained unconvinced. Analysts in psychology, body language, and true crime media dissected the footage. They noted that Burke's eye movements and hand gestures often didn't match his speech, that his stiff posture suggested defensiveness, and that his ever-present smile appeared inappropriate given the subject. Public reactions split. Some saw Burke as an awkward man, nervous under pressure, struggling to express himself. Others saw signs of detachment or deception. The timing of the interview was also significant. It aired alongside CBS's The Case of JonBenét Ramsey, which hypothesized that Burke may have accidentally killed his sister and that his parents covered it up. Many viewed Burke's Dr. Phil appearance as a counteroffensive, a PR campaign to push back against that narrative. Dr. Phil later confirmed that Burke's legal team had full oversight of the interview. Questions were pre-approved, and certain segments were edited before airing. Still, Dr. Phil defended its integrity, saying he believed Burke told the truth, and that he and his staff observed him closely over several days. His conclusion: Burke showed signs of long-term anxiety, not guilt. But public suspicion persisted. Instead of resolving the controversy, the interview reignited it. Within months, the Ramsey family filed a $750 million defamation lawsuit against CBS, arguing the documentary falsely implicated Burke. The case settled in 2019 under confidential terms. Lingering questions. Critics noted that even in his Dr. Phil interview, Burke never expressed curiosity about who killed his sister. He didn't speculate, didn't theorize, didn't even ask why. His responses remained short, reserved, and emotionally distant. Some psychologists argued this reflected trauma-induced suppression. Others believed it revealed something darker. Burke's media debut, the heavy involvement of his legal team, and his unusual demeanor during the interview were all flagged as red signs suggesting he might have known more than he was willing to admit. While Dr. Phil gave him a platform to defend himself, the overall response remained divided. For many, the interview raised more doubts than answers. Theories surrounding Burke's role go beyond the idea that he accidentally killed JonBenét and was later protected by his parents. Some theories stretch into scenarios far beyond what a 9-year-old could reasonably have been capable of. One of the most widely discussed is the so-called playing doctor theory. This idea didn't come from official police files, but instead emerged from public speculation and independent investigators, most notably James Kolar, a former lead investigator who wrote Foreign Faction. Kolar suggested that certain behavioral and forensic evidence might point toward an inappropriate but non-criminal interaction between the siblings. This theory doesn't assume malicious intent or adult-level abuse. Instead, it proposes that Burke may have engaged in a boundary-crossing act of curiosity, a kind sometimes observed in unsupervised sibling relationships. Forensic findings noted signs of minor genital injury on JonBenét that didn't match typical patterns of adult sexual assault. Some experts believe these injuries could have been caused by a small object, or even a child's finger. Importantly, law enforcement never formally accused Burke of molestation. Still, the evidence raised unsettling questions. Were these injuries the result of a childish but inappropriate game gone wrong? Burke's past behavior adds troubling context. According to housekeepers and investigative reports, he had a history of smearing feces on JonBenét's toys and bedroom walls. While disturbing, such behavior could indicate emotional issues like jealousy, a desire for control, or unresolved sibling rivalry. Another strong circumstantial link was the bowl of pineapple found on the kitchen table. Burke's fingerprints were on it, and JonBenét's autopsy revealed partially digested pineapple in her stomach, meaning she had eaten it shortly before her death. This points to the possibility that Burke and JonBenét were together in the kitchen late at night. What began as a snack could have escalated into an argument, physical struggle, or some kind of play that crossed boundaries. If JonBenét protested or cried out, Burke might have reacted in frustration or fear, possibly striking her. Medical examiners highlighted that JonBenét's genital injuries were fresh but did not bleed significantly, a detail that suggested they weren't caused by a violent adult assault. Instead, they were more consistent with contact from a smaller, less forceful object, perhaps applied without understanding the harm it could cause. The lack of semen or adult male DNA further weakened the intruder theory. However, the apparent cleaning of the area raised suspicions that someone in the house tried to erase evidence of something inappropriate, even if not criminal in the adult sense. Burke consistently avoided discussing the night of December 25th. He often deflected to unrelated topics like video games or Legos. When asked about the basement, where JonBenét's body was found, he denied going there, even though in a psychological session, he later sketched the basement in striking detail, including the wine cellar where her body was discovered. This contradiction only deepened suspicion. To be clear, this theory remains speculative. No witnesses ever testified that Burke played doctor with JonBenét. No physical evidence definitively proved it, and no confession or direct statement has ever confirmed it. Still, when considering the injuries, the possible cleanup, Burke's history of boundary violations and his eerie emotional detachment, it's easy to understand why the theory has persisted for decades. Another line of thought paints Burke not as a perpetrator, but as a victim. According to this view, Burke may have grown up in a highly controlled, emotionally repressive environment that shaped how he responded before and after the crime. While there is no direct proof of abuse, his behavior, psychological profile, and circumstantial evidence suggest he may have been affected by long-standing family dysfunction and emotional suppression. Observers consistently noted his emotional inconsistency. Whether speaking with police, psychologists, or appearing on national television, Burke often smiled or appeared oddly relaxed, even when recalling traumatic details of his sister's death. While unsettling, psychologists say such responses aren't necessarily malicious. They may reflect emotional detachment, often seen in children who have experienced trauma or long-term suppression of feelings. Even Burke's language gave hints. When speaking about JonBenét, he often used distant, detached phrasing, describing her less as a beloved sister and more as part of an event he was disconnected from. Burke often described his sister as the one who always messes with my stuff, a cold and detached characterization. In nearly every interview, he avoided discussing the crime directly, instead redirecting to toys, video games, or unrelated topics. This consistent deflection, paired with his flat emotional affect, led many experts to suspect he had either been trained to suppress difficult emotions or had instinctively developed psychological defenses to protect himself. Before the murder, Burke had already exhibited behavior that crossed normal childhood boundaries, most notably smearing feces on JonBenét's possessions, bedroom walls, and even her Christmas gifts. Psychologists argue this type of boundary-violating behavior can sometimes reflect a child reenacting their own experiences of emotional, physical, or psychological violation. While it does not automatically indicate abuse, it is often found in children exposed to deep family dysfunction or inappropriate environments. Multiple psychologists who reviewed Burke's interviews observed the same troubling pattern. His descriptions lacked emotional depth. He often recounted his sister's death as though it had happened to someone else, displaying signs of dissociation, mentally separating himself from trauma. Rather than showing fear, sadness, or anger, Burke seemed emotionally absent, narrating as a detached observer. This fueled suspicion that he might have endured long-term emotional or psychological trauma. Immediately following JonBenét's death, Burke was removed from the crime scene. He was not promptly interviewed by police and was shielded from both law enforcement and the public by his parents and their legal team. Unlike many children in traumatic circumstances, he was never connected with a grief counselor appointed by authorities. Instead, every point of outside contact was filtered through his parents and lawyers. This high level of control persisted for years. Burke did not publicly attend memorials or funerals, avoided the media until nearly 20 years later, and never underwent a law enforcement supervised polygraph. Equally striking was the absence of visible parental comfort. No photographs, reports, or witness accounts described John or Patsy physically consoling their only surviving child in the immediate aftermath. Instead, Burke was removed, both physically and emotionally, from the grieving process, as though he were a bystander, not a participant. Experts note that in families with dysfunction or hidden abuse, such emotional distancing is common. It can leave children's emotional needs unacknowledged, causing lasting psychological effects. Some forensic psychologists argue that Burke exhibited traits consistent with children raised in highly repressive or authoritarian households, where emotional expression is minimized or invalidated. Such environments often produce coping mechanisms like dissociation, emotional suppression, and detachment. If Burke grew up in a home where vulnerability was discouraged, his flat effect may not have been abnormal. It may have been his only survival strategy. The Ramsey family's obsession with maintaining a polished public image also cannot be ignored. Patsy, a former beauty queen, cultivated the appearance of a flawless family. Such environments often foster a don't talk about it culture, where emotional pain and family struggles are buried to protect appearances. Friends recalled that the Ramseys avoided unpleasant topics, even in the face of devastating tragedy. This culture of silence likely reinforced in Burke the belief that expressing vulnerability was dangerous. The family's history of litigation underscores their need for control. They aggressively sued media outlets for negative portrayals of Burke, including a $750 million lawsuit against CBS following its 2016 documentary that speculated about his involvement. Even Burke's 2016 Dr. Phil appearance, a supposed opportunity for transparency, was tightly edited, pre-approved by lawyers, and conducted under carefully controlled conditions. To critics, this reflected a family less concerned with truth and more invested in controlling Burke's image. People who knew Burke as a child often described him as quiet, withdrawn, and disengaged. While not diagnostic, such traits are common in children who have experienced trauma, especially in environments where they cannot ask questions, show pain, or receive emotional support. The Ramseys never publicly acknowledged Burke having any psychological struggles, not even mild issues like anxiety. Their silence has fueled speculation that something significant may have been found and deliberately concealed. Though no evidence definitively proves Burke was a victim of abuse, the accumulation of circumstantial signs, his flat affect, dissociation, boundary-violating behaviors, and the strict control over his narrative has kept this theory alive. Whether he was emotionally suppressed, psychologically burdened, or simply isolated by design, the possibility that Burke too suffered in silence remains one of the case's most haunting layers. From the very start of the investigation, Burke was never charged, never named an official suspect, and never confessed. Yet in the court of public opinion, he has remained central to suspicion for nearly 3 decades. That suspicion arose from 3 forces: investigative gaps, media fixation, and public hunger for closure. Investigatively, Burke was not questioned the day his sister's body was discovered. He wasn't meaningfully interviewed until 11 days later, and even then the process was controlled by lawyers, not detectives. He was never cross-examined, despite being the only child in the home and arguably the most important witness. That silence left a vacuum, and the public filled it with theories. The media amplified this vacuum. True crime specials, books, documentaries, even late-night comedians turned Burke into the strange, quiet boy in the shadows. Every awkward smile, every refusal to cry publicly, every dodged question became evidence in the public's eyes. His 2016 Dr. Phil interview, intended to clear his name, instead fueled further suspicion. Analysts dissected his body language, interpreting nervousness or trauma as deceit. Finally, the public's expectations played a role. Society expects grieving children to cry, ask questions, or break down emotionally. Burke never did. He spoke about JonBenét like a classmate, not a sister, and clung to neutral topics like video games. Whether this was a defense mechanism, emotional suppression, or something darker, it didn't fit the narrative people were looking for. The result was a perfect storm: a child who behaved strangely, parents who tightly controlled access, and a media eager for a villain. Even if Burke is entirely innocent, and he may well be, these forces created an indelible image of guilt. In the absence of confessions, arrests, or conclusive evidence, suspicion shifted to behavior instead of facts. And Burke's behavior, whether trauma-based or not, never matched what the public expected. Decades later, his name still lingers at the center of one of America's most infamous unsolved cases. The JonBenét Ramsey case remains a haunting example of how investigative failures, media spectacle, and public suspicion can intertwine. It showed what happens when a crime scene is mishandled, evidence disturbed, and authorities divided. It also revealed how damaging speculation can be. Burke, only 9 years old, was thrust into suspicion not because of hard evidence, but because of his demeanor. Ultimately, this case forces us to confront deeper lessons about how society handles child trauma. Whether Burke was a victim, a witness, or simply a grieving brother, he was offered little protection from scrutiny, suspicion, and isolation. The case reminds us that justice is not only about finding a killer, it is also about protecting the innocent, honoring the truth, and resisting the transformation of private pain into public spectacle.